I know this is not an HTMX conference, but what's about to happen is going to be yet more talking about hypermedia, so I hope everyone's very, very excited about that. But something that I do want to just shout out one more time is I cannot believe how smoothly this conference has gone. So again, thank you, Journey, for this. I've never been in a conference where people plug things in and audio works 100% of the time. There's no difficulties. It just is so good. So it's just like, this is just mind-blowing for me that audio actually works. They must not be on Linux. That's like my only guess what they're doing back there. It's pretty impressive. But our next speaker, Ben, he is going to be talking about hypermedia again, but it's going to be very exciting. It's about the back end this time as opposed to the front end. And he has a past. You may have heard of Apple, Symantec, the White House. Yeah, they're pretty popular here. And then even a bunch more. And so now, right now, he freelances for, he's a full-stack freelance engineer for Mozilla.org. Donates his time there. That's pretty awesome. And he's going to come up here and talk about some pretty good stuff. I don't want to give away too much of it, you know.
Thank you. Also, I get a hug after, right?
You get a hug afterwards. Oh, right. I wanted a fist bump.
Cable management. We're going to reach just fine. All right. Hey, I'm Ben Damman. What a great conference so far. This is really exciting. It's my first time here. And as the Primogen said, I'm going to talk about hypermedia middleware, whatever the heck that is, right? If you Google for that, you'll find a few random papers and things, but it's definitely not a term of art. Maybe we'll bring it into style. And what I'm going to talk about is a different type of style, architectural style, right? And this is something when we talk about HTMX, we talk about hypermedia, REST as an architectural style. This is really, in some ways it's a mundane extension of that. But what I want to do is tell you the story of how I came up with this. And that'll inform whether you think this might be a useful strategy for your projects. In 2012, so we're going back a bit, I was at Symantec, hired into their configuration management group, and I was there to work on this project that had been languishing for a couple of years. They just couldn't quite get it over the line. They were having a lot of meetings, and as a Rails developer, I came in to work on Nighthawk, but not the stealth fighter. That's not what the name came from. It's actually the common Nighthawk. Which they explained to me, oh, it's a bird that catches bugs at night. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. Kind of an ugly bird, honestly, but you know, they make sense, right? So it's a Rails app, Postgres database, and the purpose was display results from half a dozen automated testing systems, right? All in one place. So the engineers there working on net backup could see all these results from multiple operating systems, combinations of backups across different operating systems. It was actually pretty impressive. And there were like, 6 teams with, 3 or 4 engineers on each of them. So a straightforward app, right? But what could go wrong? So, I'm thinking Rails app will probably have some APIs, but no. The way they wanted to sort of inject the test results was directly with SQL inserts, right? And has anybody ever heard, like, don't integrate at the database level, right? This is a poor choice. I don't think it's so bad if you control end-to-end, but if you have 6 different teams, good luck agreeing on a schema. And that's why in bold here I put 5-hour-long meetings, right? We would bike shed for hours, and they'd been doing this for at least a year, I think, like once a month, twice a month, trying to hash out things like, you call that AMD 64, but we call it Win 64, right? We need to decide, and it just became this endless debate, and of course they couldn't agree. There was no way to break the ties across 6 different teams, and they were all using different, tech stacks, which means they had different reporting formats. One of them, they were like, hey, can we just send you a serialized Perl hash? I was like, maybe, as long as I can parse it. And all these teams had limited capacity to begin with. So these 5-hour meetings, that was pretty much it. After those meetings, they didn't want to talk about this anymore. They thought, well, I already spent 5 hours or 10 hours this month. I don't have time to do this extra thing. And of course, that created a lot of interpersonal tension, right? Because people started to butt heads and disagree philosophically. It was just really counterproductive. And the only other complication was it had to run on-prem. So that limited some of the stuff we do. And I wanted to mention Conway's Law because I keep running into this, whether I'm working for the federal government or in other large organizations and small ones. The way that you all collaborate and communicate, those patterns really shape the product you develop. And it's really kind of, I don't know, insidious or subtle, but you can literally see, like, there were 6 teams, 6 different testing tools, and they struggled to create one unified view, right? So this is a perfect kind of case study where that's relevant. So somehow, we had to figure out how to flip the script. I was hoping for, can we just do HTTP post and send whatever you want? It'd be great if we could all do JSON or some convenient format, perhaps. But I wanted them to be able to use any, HTTP client they wanted. I mean, they were using awk for certain things. So, if we just wanted to add into a bash script, make a curl request as part of your test suite runs to just send me whatever the output is. I thought that would be straightforward for them. And I was also very concerned about losing data just in the normal course of business, or spikes in traffic, right? Because some of these would create a stampede where you'd have all these test results sort of posted, within a minute of each other. And I also wanted to see the actual data sets. You sit in these meetings and it's very easy to kind of hand-wavily say, well, our data is this. And then when you actually get it, right, how many times do you find out, oh, yeah, sorry, it's not exactly what we said, it's totally different. And so in these 5-hour-long meetings, while they were, talking about very specific things, it turned out that it was missing a lot of the actual detail you needed to be successful to actually reconcile these differences. And so I said, well, what if we didn't have to reconcile those differences? I don't want to build consensus. I just want to make a thing work, right? And even if we built the app where some of these things, weren't named the same thing, like in the UI, it's still better to have that adjacent to each other. So you could click through different test results, and maybe the user has to understand that this group calls it AMD 64 and this one calls it Win 64. That's probably okay, or at least as an intermediate step, right, to make progress. And so, if we really reduce it down, I was realizing that we needed a reliable receptacle before, right, to precede our web app, so that we would do the collection first, and then we would somehow get it into the web app, normalize it into the Postgres database, do whatever we needed to do there, to make it comport with basically what the UI wanted, as opposed to what the testing teams thought that it should have. And I realized, anybody use React? Anyone familiar with this? Yes, okay, a couple people. Boo, yeah, and I heard horror stories at Apple, actually. I think they tried to use it for blob storage for iCloud, and it was awful. It was just too much scale, early days. But I realized that it already has this generic HTTP API, which was kind of what I wanted, because what I didn't want to do was build an API for each team, custom for their content type, formats, and so on. Because I didn't want to recreate the same database schema problem. I just wanted them to have a dumping ground, but I needed some controls around it. And it turns out, surprise, Hypermedia REST gives us a lot of those controls and the right design elements to keep it simple, do routing like Alex was talking about. It's just such an elegant design. Can we just reuse that? And so what React does, just like S3 or other similar things, they just have this construct of a bucket. And so I said, well, gosh, why don't I just give people a bucket, and assign a bucket, and then have them post their results there. So what I ended up writing was this thing called Nest. Had to keep a bird theme, right? This is our receptacle for more than just eggs. And it was essentially a reverse proxy. I was using Ruby at the time, so I was using rack middleware, right, to basically intercept requests kind of at the front door, and then forward that on to our React cluster. So React was responsible for our durability, and we just had this thin veneer, right, of things like we needed some basic auth. I didn't want teams accidentally, posting to the wrong bucket. It was an internal tool, so it wasn't that security sensitive, but we just needed a few things, right, that React didn't do, or it didn't do it the way I wanted. Things like URL patterns, right, might be different. And so this nest thing, it really just had these two jobs, first and foremost, to perform that duty of reliable blob storage so that we would get this data and we would save it and we wouldn't lose it, right? The first day, actually, that I showed up for this job, somebody walked up to me at about 11 o'clock and said, hey, did you hear what happened? No, I'm new here. I didn't do anything yet, really. And they said, well, the system's down because the network got busted. Okay, so we have some kind of net split, and it turned out that we lost all the test results, right, for like a day, like a night and a day. And so, I don't want that to happen again, right? So that's why that's important. The second job was just to notify this Rails app that there was work waiting to be done, right? So this is just a basic, kind of background job queue, right? We use Sidekick. And so this simple rack middleware would just, inject these Sidekick jobs right into Redis. And then assuming the Rails workers are running, it's just going to pull whenever there's work available. And all I really had to say was, much like we do with file system changes, right, in development, this thing changed. Should we do something? The worker would go fetch that object and then see if it can parse it. What rules can it apply? Or even do we want to just route it to like an internal, controller action or something? Where it maybe didn't come through a traditional web request, but we could process it in kind of the same way that you might be accustomed to do in Rails. So as a diagram, this is really what it looked like. At the top there, we've got like our post request. Like we're just going to dump some object, some blob of data, whatever content type that particular team wants to send me, into a bucket. And we go through auth, we make whatever manipulations of those incoming and outgoing requests that we need to. We got our event producer that kicks out the jobs to the queue to be worked on. And then just a simple middleware that just forward the request, right, to our React cluster. So what would it return, right? Because in this scenario, and this will impact if you use this approach for your projects, there's a level of indirection here where what you get back is the 201 created response. And typically that's going to have a location header of like, hey, we created this object. This is the actual full unique URL for that object. And so you could imagine that in this pattern, a client might need to make a couple of requests. First to say, here's my command, essentially. Here's what I want. Here's what I'm providing. And then maybe it has to look up another location, perhaps in a different bucket, to get the actual, if it's looking for output, looking for that output. So it's a little different than a direct request. What did we achieve, right? $2 words, right? Decouple the data collection process from the Rails app itself. Right? The Rails app only had to worry about UI then and how it talked to its database, which nobody else had to know the schema of. Right? I didn't have to negotiate anymore. I could basically tell people to take a hike. It's my database. Leave me alone. What data do you have? And it actually threw people for a loop, right? Because if I tell people, like, look, just here's your bucket, here's your URL, give me the stuff. And they're like, well, what do you want? And I'm like, what do you have? Just send it all. I don't know what you have. I can't answer that question. So, this solves that problem, that logjam. And these workers, right, I didn't actually have to implement them for everybody right at the start. In fact, I did this. I just said, hey, here's your bucket, here's your bucket. They started sending things in when they were able to. I, of course, could tell when they started doing that. And I could prioritize. I could say, I'm going to do this team first, and get their whole thing working, ingest their data, use that to inform my Postgres schema, and then I'm going to repeat that for these others. But I'm doing it when I'm ready. And what's cool about that is that all the data was just sitting there waiting. So when I got around to it, I maybe had a month of that data that I could go through. And that was pretty impressive because they're like, oh, he just put this in there. We sent it a month ago. We just thought it wasn't going to make it in. I think from a troubleshooting point of view, this is also really great because normally we have our API requests, they're just ephemeral, right? We're looking in logs of various things to try to figure out what the heck did they send us that choked, this system. In this case, you just look at it. It's at a bucket, a known URL, and I can hit it with a browser, So I don't need any special tools myself. And I can share that link if I open that up. So anybody who I need help with, hey, what happened here? You see this looks like malformed JSON. Can you figure out what that was? And then when they want to fix it, I don't have to do anything else. They could just put over the top of that object, and the worker would kick off and process that, and ideally it would work that time. So one of the things I learned here was something about Postel's law, right? This idea, essentially from when networking was becoming a thing, this was a great philosophy to adopt because it's effective, and it's actually one of the reasons why the web and the internet is like the best information system in the known universe so far, right? If you're liberal in what you accept, that means you can accept it. You can hear the other party. Then you can make decisions about what to send back. But if you prevent the other party from being able to send anything, you don't have the basis for a conversation, right? It could be irrecoverable. And the other benefit of this system is that the workers actually scale independently. So depending on what you have going on in these buckets, you can scale one worker up so that you can do more of those jobs in parallel. But yet it's still a very simple distributed system. There are some problems though. You want to be careful. And some of you may have done this, one architecture that this reminds me of is like if you're just using Lambda functions, right? People do this all the time with S3, right? You trigger an event when something changes in your S3 bucket. Maybe you're resizing an image or something automatically through a Lambda function. Well, that's great, but what happens if you have things that are triggered off of some change in a bucket, and maybe the output action is to put something in the bucket, and now you have this infinite loop, right, of activity, or like a cascading stampede where you just keep doing more and more work over and over again, ad infinitum until everything explodes. So back to Walrus. This is the Walrus meme. Since we're talking about memes at this conference, I thought this should be in here. Also, I didn't know, until you spoke earlier, Carson, that buckets were instrumental in the development of HTMX. You said you were sitting on a bucket. So I'd like to hear more about that. And funny story about this. This is actually not a walrus. Does anybody know what this is? Nope. Not a manatee. It's an elephant seal. But, I mean, what are you going to call this meme if you have to say elephant seal? It doesn't work. Elephant seal with a blue bucket, I don't know, it sounds like some kind of plumbing issue. So the other observation I made, and obviously that's where the Walrus name came from, the other observation I made is that basically everything becomes an API client. You end up, if you so choose, you can use this approach to say, look, we have sort of this shared tuple space, right? But it's event-driven. And we can put images in there, we can put JSON, we can do anything we want, and I don't have to edit the API code, the routing code, or whatever, right, to tell someone, hey, here's your bucket, you want to do some crazy thing? Have at it. And we'll figure out what kind of worker we need to write or what the interaction model is. And the other cool thing, if you use content negotiation, or maybe you want to just detect based off of a user agent string, hey, I'm hitting this bucket URL from a browser. Well, you could do things like prettify the JSON object that's returned, right? And other such things, still at that Walrus level. So you're not really changing the actual contents, but you're making it more navigable. Maybe you're able to add hypermedia controls based on the controls declared in your hypermedia format, right? So you have all this flexibility, and everything is just sort of an API consumer, which really simplifies how you think about it. And if you just have to decide, like, is this a long-running thing? Is it something that we can just write as a script? Is it a browser? Is it the links browser? It could be whatever. So I had hoped to open source Walrus for the conference. I would have loved to do so. It wasn't in the cards. I've implemented this using Elixir. It feels really good, and I'm developing some patterns around it. And I'm using this to build Missoula.org. So Missoula.org is essentially a search engine with other attachments. So I'm using LLMs for some things. This pattern works really well, especially for those longer running things like chaining LLM activities together and posting those responses. And I want to inspect, what did this LLM tell somebody? I need that. I can't throw that away. not just for troubleshooting, but sort of for legal hold reasons, potentially. And so, anyway, if you're interested, when I do open source that, send me an email today, subject line, ICANN has buckets, and I will notify you. So how are we doing on time? Okay. Can we do some Q&A maybe? Who's got questions or comments? This might be really stupid. You can totally tell me. Nobody? Going once? Going twice? Someone heckle at least. Is that true?
Sorry, just break the ice.
It's like Minnesotans,
What kind of constraints did you have? Did you consider like just public cloud services, buckets in AWS, whatever? Like, what drove you to kind of this?
I thought React was pretty cool. I was excited about that. But fundamentally, it had to be inside their network. Like, they had their own labs and everything. So, not so much because it was sensitive information. I mean, in a way it was, but just because that's how the information flowed, and all the systems were internal, basically in the same location. One more?
When you mentioned you gave the buckets to the teams that had different ways of sending data, would you just process one team, create standards around it, and then process the other team at your pace?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I kind of did two at a time, but it's the same principle of just what can you handle, which has a certain, what are we using the word, platonic ideal? There's like this symmetry of like, oh, and the Rails app can only process things as fast as it can. So, it's sort of buckets all the way down, I guess.
And so what happens with the payloads that, say, the original team decides to change the way they send data, and it will result in broken parsing?
Yes, that's a great question. So what would happen, right, is that the worker would fail, and that would be a thing that you'd find in your logs or you'd get some alert about. Then you can just go investigate and look at, compare prior data to that data and go, oh, they renamed a key or changed the format of some object in there. And so, what we actually encountered, I mean, maybe in other systems it would be more involved, but usually it was just like very simple changes, or like, it'd be like, oh yeah, this is invalid JSON because they, some output from the test was included, and that wasn't valid JSON, and they weren't encoding properly.
My final question. So the logs would be captured in CloudWatch or buckets, or would it be like database? Oh.
Yeah, we just had regular log files. Again, we weren't really able to use S3 or CloudWatch or any of that. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Uh-oh.
I'm just curious, what prompted the use of buckets over like a durable queue or something like Kafka to handle the ingestion of the data?
Right. I don't remember when Kafka came out, but mind you, this is like 2012. So a lot of those things were, I think, still fairly nascent in their development. We also didn't have, it was just like 2.5 of us who worked on this, and Pete, who was the other kind of core person, he threw together like all the Terraform stuff to run like the React cluster and Middleware apps and all that. So it really was essentially me, and then I collaborated with some of the other team members, to kind of figure out what the UI should look like and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I have more of a comment than a question.
Uh-oh.
I'm the one that heckled you. HTMX was tweeting at me, so I wasn't looking at your screen, and I thought you said, who uses React? And so I said, boo. I'm sure that React is fantastic, and thank you for showing it to us.
Yes. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. And there's a reason I showed the logo. That was...
Yeah, I wasn't looking. It's his fault.
Shut up, Warren.
Yeah, I'm just curious, did you run into any issues scaling the like Walrus infrastructure that was running on that network, or did it run pretty seamlessly?
No, it ran pretty seamlessly. I mean, there was so little Ruby that there wasn't really any performance consideration. We weren't really at any huge scale, right, that I'm used to now. It was relatively small. But I guess I would say, even though it was a relatively simple environment, like I think our cluster just had like 3 nodes, right, for React. Like we weren't very large. And we would clean stuff out. We didn't need to store stuff forever. So I think the way to think about it is that because the different pieces are sort of composed in a convenient way, you can shape the scaling however you need, kind of in the right level of granularity. But React is in Erlang, and operationally it was really great. If that had been a problem, that would have been a major problem, right? It was kind of the linchpin of the whole thing. But that was really easy to deploy, even though it was a distributed system, around durable storage. So yeah, it worked out pretty well, and we had a lot of flexibility.
I have one question from the YouTube stream. Armin from somewhere in the interwebs says, so looking to the future, do you think more approaches using Hypermedia will be adapted for back-end services?
Personally, I hope so. I don't have a lot of faith that that'll happen, or maybe that's not even a good idea, right? I'm not convinced that, this, just like HTMX, this is not the be-all, end-all. It's not a panacea. And essentially all I've done, right, is just separate, right, our HTTP requests from our actual application. So it's not even that earth-shattering. But I do think in terms of hypermedia in general, if you're familiar with like the H factors, right, this is worth looking up if you're starting to get into hypermedia. What are the different aspects of hypermedia? HTML, as Alex said, like HTML is great, but we need to evolve it more, right? There's more things that we want to be able to signal in our payloads. And other than HTML, there really, in my opinion, aren't a lot of good hypermedia formats. Although I did look at Falcor, actually, when I was at Apple, so kudos to the prime. No, really? I'm working for that hug after this talk, so. Any more?
It just seems like this setup might work really nicely with kind of like a traditional search, because it's all just kind of files. Did you end up doing like a keyword search or anything like that along with it?
So we were using like Postgres search functionality for this particular application. For Missoula.org, a lot of the, in many ways, like search results with like a description and the link and the title, those things are kind of like static assets, right? I mean, they change. So I am storing things like that. So I can just fetch summaries of things, and I can link together. This was one thing that was convenient about React, even though it was this NoSQL solution that did MapReduce queries and was kind of cumbersome, and you had to set up secondary indexes if you really wanted to do anything serious. So it was very manual in that way. But it does allow you to link resources using, I think it's just a link header or something like that. And so you could actually have a whole kind of lineage of like, here's the blob we scraped from that website. Here's the result we turned it into. Maybe here's a screenshot, right, taken of the page to use as a thumbnail. And all of those could actually, if you pull one, you could actually see, oh, there's a link. This actually is related to that original, crawled page.
How did you mark the records in the bucket processed, and how did you do the data retention versus cleanup?
So, yeah, so how did we, sorry, that threw me.
Oh, so the question is, how did you manage data retention? As the bucket receives new data, how did you mark some of the pieces of data that's been processed versus to retain the data historically?
So we just had like a cron job that would clean up garbage. But you could again, there's a lot of flexibility. So you could delete the resource after you process it. But there's also no reason to do that right away unless other things are going on automatically. So if you just leave it there and garbage collect it every week or month or whatever cadence you want, then you don't, whatever queue you're using, right? You could use Kafka, you could use RabbitMQ, whatever you want. You can pretty much rely on that, right? And you kind of need to, right? That's the point of those brokers is like, I want that message delivered at least once or just once or whatever the semantics can be. And so that's the bookkeeping, right, of what's been processed and what hasn't. At the same time, if you have linkages between objects, you can easily say, this is the outcome, right, of this initial object. So like, here's the, and I actually did stuff where I could control the workers and like scale them up in terms of number of instances and things based on putting a document in a bucket, right? And you could, it's sort of like get ops or something. You could actually drive your whole infrastructure off of, a YAML or JSON object in there. And when you do a put over the top of it, you're changing the layout of your infrastructure, right? And so, similar to how a Terraform stores state, right? So cool, great question.
Hi, I just had a question I missed. Is this proprietary or open source?
It will be open source soon. I would say there's really nothing that proprietary about it, right? I'm just applying Hypermedia and REST, in a slightly different way. And that's one of the reasons I thought, well, even though I'm using this for things and I get a lot of mileage out of it, it's worth open sourcing because I don't think you can really patent, APIs anymore. So
did you use Walrus then as a safety precaution to prevent leaks of code and people duplicating code from some firm? Or was this more for creating and organizing an internal structure?
it was really just the internal benefits.
Excellent, thanks.
From a business standpoint, do you see yourself partnering or working with organizations like Missoula Events? That seems like a model that would make sense for what you're doing.
Right. So I've met with them. I think we will be collaborating on a couple of things, hopefully. A lot of what a search engine is actually just kind of the rising tide that lifts all boats, right? I get to index everything. And so I can help people even if I don't partner with them overtly. But there's lots of opportunities to partner with government agencies and provide digital services like a better parking app and things. So I am looking to do partnerships, and that's actually why this approach, to the previous question, it's sort of the opposite. Instead of trying to protect things, this is actually a convenient way to sort of make it easy to expose things and have them be sort of alive and functional, even though they're not directly exposing a straight shot to your, MVC framework and what have you. So in the same way that these teams at Symantec could just fire and forget and send things in, I would love to replicate that model and have more participants. So as we get into more community-generated content or people who, if you remember the early days of Google, you would say, hey, here's my web page, please index it. Right? They had a form for that. I may do something like that. Well, it'd be great if there were different ways people could just use simple HTTP tools to make those suggestions, submit that content. And if there's other app developers who want to leverage Missoula.org and our tooling to build some other extensions of things, it makes that much easier than trying to have schema design meetings or API spec negotiations, right? I can just say, look, I'll just give you a bucket, and they could use it just within themselves, or we're coordinating, but I want to see what they're putting in before I invest a lot of time in maybe writing some custom code to handle that. Great question.
I think we have time for one more question. Or no more questions.
We've exhausted all questions. Was it? Okay. Good job, everybody. And thank you. Oh, here we go.
Thank you.
Did I suck up enough? Is that...
You know what? You did mention Falcor,